My name is Rowan Calloway, and I'm 31 years old. The morning of my sister's wedding, my mother pulled me aside in the hallway of the hotel and said, quietly, so no one else could hear, "Just sit quietly today. Don't embarrass us." She handed me a printed schedule, 4 pages, color-coded, every name and every task accounted for. Mine wasn't on it once. I didn't argue. I smiled and folded it in half and put it in my bag, right next to the folder that held every vendor contract, every signed agreement, every confirmation email, $41,000 of commitments, all of them made in my name. What happened later that afternoon, in front of the groom's family and every person my mother had spent 2 years trying to impress, none of them saw it coming. And neither did she. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people finally let the paperwork do the shouting. If you're new here, drop a comment and tell me what brought you, and if this story sounds familiar, hit subscribe. I put out a new one every week. I grew up in a house where the rules were simple, even if no one ever said them out loud. My sister Petra was the one you talked about at dinner. She was 3 years younger than me, and she moved through rooms the way certain people do, as if the lighting had been arranged in advance. She was funny and pretty, and she cried in a way that made people want to fix things for her. My parents adored her. That's not a complicated statement. It's just true. I was the one who fixed things. I don't say that with bitterness, or at least I've spent enough years working through it that I can say it plainly now. From the time I was about 14, I was the one who handled logistics, who called the insurance company when my dad had a fender bender and didn't want to deal with the paperwork, who researched my grandmother's assisted living options when she could no longer manage the stairs in her own house, who quietly took on the second job my freshman year of college so I could send money home when my parents' restaurant hit a rough patch, and who never once brought it up at the dinner table because I already knew it wouldn't land the way I needed it to. I work in commercial interior design. I have a small firm for people based out of Portland, and we do the kind of work that nobody photographs for magazines but that keeps restaurants and boutique hotels looking like somebody thought about them. I am good at timelines and vendors and the particular kind of negotiation that happens when a general contractor is 3 weeks behind and a client is calling twice a day. I am very good at making complicated things look effortless. This is relevant. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Adeline, was the only person in my family who seemed to understand what I actually did and why it mattered. She had run a dry cleaning business for 31 years with her husband, my grandfather, and she had a dry cleaner's understanding of the world. Things did not stay clean on their own. Someone pressed them. Someone checked the tags. Someone kept the books. She called me every Sunday. Not to ask how I was feeling, she was not that kind of grandmother, but to ask what I had solved that week. It was her version of love, and I received it completely. She passed away 18 months before Petra's wedding, in October, quietly, in the room she'd lived in at Meadowbrook for 4 years. She left me a letter. I'll get to the letter. Petra got engaged to a man named Garrett in the spring, 2.5 years before I'm writing this. Garrett was fine. He was careful and even-tempered, and he worked in commercial real estate, and he had a mother named Sylvia who wore good jewelry and asked precise questions, and who, I would learn, missed nothing. The moment Petra got the ring on her finger, my mother entered a state I can only describe as competitive wedding planning psychosis. She had a vision. The vision involved a venue in the hills outside Bend, Oregon. A property called Harlan Ridge that she had seen in a magazine and had apparently been mentally booking for years before an actual occasion arose. She wanted 200 guests, a tented reception, a 4-piece string quartet for the ceremony, hand-stamped calligraphy invitations, and a custom floral installation above the head table that she had described to me, in detail, at least 7 times in the 6 months following the engagement. She had not, in any of those conversations, mentioned a budget. My father's restaurant had recovered from the rough patch of my freshman year of college, but it had not recovered extravagantly. They owned a mid-sized Italian place in Bend, good food, loyal regulars, decent margins in summer, tight margins in winter. They were comfortable. They were not 200-guest tented reception comfortable. I knew this. My mother knew this. We did not discuss it directly for approximately 4 months, and then one evening in August she called me and said, in the particular tone she used when she was asking for something she didn't want to name as a request, Rowan, you know how these things work better than any of us. I was hoping you might help coordinate some of the vendor side. Just logistics. You're so good at that. I said yes.
Of course I said yes.
What followed was 18 months of work that I will summarize briefly here, because the full accounting of it would take longer than the wedding itself. I negotiated the Harlan Ridge contract, a venue that required a substantial deposit and a named account holder, which was me because I had a business account and a track record they could verify, and my parents did not. I booked the caterer, a firm out of Bend called Meridian Events that I had worked with on a commercial project and trusted. I contracted the florist, a woman named Bette Larson who did extraordinary work and who, when I explained what my mother wanted above the head table, said, "I can do that, but I need a client with a real budget," and I told her I was the client. I handled the string quartet, a group out of Portland that required a formal agreement and a 50% deposit. I arranged the transportation, a vintage shuttle van for the wedding party and a town car for my parents, because my mother mentioned once that she wanted the family to arrive together, and I made it happen. I also, at various points, simply paid for things. A deposit here when the timeline was tight and my parents' account wasn't liquid. An upgrade there when my mother changed her mind about the linens 3 weeks before the date, and the original order was already in production. A conference call with Sylvia's event contact in Seattle, who had suggestions about the catering lineup that required a quick budget revision, a revision I absorbed because it was easier than renegotiating from scratch. By the time we were 6 weeks out from the wedding, I had personally signed contracts and/or made payments totaling $41,000. My parents had contributed $18,000, mostly in early deposits that I had routed through them to keep my mother's name on the visible paperwork. The day, functionally, was mine. I don't mean that in a proprietary way. I mean it literally and documentarily. No one in my family had asked to see the contracts. No one had asked what things cost, specifically, or whose name the vendors had on file. My mother had a vision and I had executed it, and the gap between those two things, between having a vision and executing one, was, as it always had been, my department. I did not resent this. Or, rather, I had made a kind of peace with it. I was good at what I did, and I had done it, and the wedding was going to be beautiful, and Petra was happy, and I told myself that was enough. And then, for weeks before the wedding, my mother called to discuss the seating chart. The call came on a Wednesday evening. I was at my desk finishing a project file when my phone lit up with my mother's name, and I answered expecting a logistics question, a vendor confirmation, a timeline adjustment, something practical. Instead, she said, "We've been going over the seating, and I want to talk to you about the reception layout." I said, "Go ahead." The head table is going to be Petra and Garrett and their attendants. And then we're doing a family table, immediate family, which is me, your father, Garrett's parents, and his sister. I waited. And then there's an extended table for cousins and close family friends, and we thought you'd be comfortable there, with the Hendersons and your Aunt Leora and that group. I set down my pen. You want me at the extended family table. It's not a slight, Rowan. It's just that the family table is going to be very visible in the photos. And we want it to look a certain way for Garrett's family. They have very specific expectations, and we want the presentation to be right. I understood what she wasn't saying. Garrett's family was from Seattle. His mother Sylvia had a particular bearing and a particular social circle, and my mother had been performing for that circle since the engagement. And I, with my small firm and my practical clothes and my habit of disappearing to make phone calls when things needed fixing, did not fit the image she was constructing. I said, "I understand," because I did. I knew you would. You're so reasonable. That's always been your thing. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time. Then I opened the vendor folder on my laptop and went through each contract, one by one, the way you check a foundation before you decide whether to build. Everything was in order. I called my friend Dessa. She runs a small catering operation out of Eugene, and she has known me for 12 years, and I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I wasn't sure yet. What I did not say was that I had already begun to understand very clearly exactly what the situation was. 2 weeks before the wedding, the program was finalized and distributed to the family by email. It was 4 pages, beautifully designed, Petra had hired a graphic designer in Portland, which I had also arranged and paid for, and it listed, in order, every person with a named role in the ceremony and reception. Officiant, readers, maid of honor, best man, parents of the bride, parents of the groom, grandparents, ushers. My name did not appear. Not once. Not in any capacity. Not even in the general acknowledgement section, which thanked the many people who helped make this day possible without specifying who those people were. I printed the program and read it twice. Then I filed it in the same folder as the vendor contracts. My cousin Daphne called me that evening. She'd seen the program. "That's not right," she said plainly. "You did everything." I told her it was fine. "Rowan, I know what I did." She was quiet. "Then, are you going to say anything?" I told her I wasn't sure yet. The week of the wedding, my mother called with a final logistics review, timing of the shuttle, confirmation of the floral delivery window, catering arrival. All questions she was directing to me because, as she put it, "You have the contacts." I answered each one. I confirmed each timeline. I did not mention the seating arrangement or the program. She did not mention them either. My father called the night before the wedding. He had a warm voice, my father. He was the kind of man who smoothed things over by being pleasant and never addressing them directly. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "Yes. Your mom is nervous. You know how she gets." "I know. Just go easy on her tomorrow, okay? She's put a lot into this." I did not say, "I know exactly how much she's put into this." I said, "I'll see you tomorrow, Dad." I slept well. I don't know how to explain that except to say that by the time the morning came, I knew exactly where I stood and exactly what I had in my hands, and there was something clarifying about that. Harlan Ridge was beautiful. I want to say that without irony, because it's true, and because I spent 18 months making it so. The property sits on a hillside outside Bend with a view of the mountains that changes color through the afternoon, pale gold at noon, amber by 4, something almost rose-colored by the time the light flattens before dusk. The tent had been installed 2 days prior, and I had walked the space that morning with Bet to confirm the floral installation above the head table. Pale ivory ranunculus and trailing eucalyptus in long cascades, exactly what my mother had described, built exactly as she'd imagined. Bet had done exceptional work. I had driven up alone. I wore a gray dress, simple, good fabric, and I had my bag with a folder in it, and I had arrived early enough to confirm the catering setup with Meridian's lead coordinator, a composed woman named Jules who had my number and who greeted me the way vendors greet the person they actually report to, with specificity, with a question list, with a look of professional relief. My mother saw me from across the tent when I arrived. She was in a pale blue dress, her hair done, looking exactly the way she had imagined herself looking. She crossed the space and hugged me and said, "You look lovely." Then, "Extended table is near the east window. I think you'll have a lovely view." And she was gone. I watched her move through the room. She was in her element, greeting, arranging, performing. She had a particular smile for Sylvia, Garrett's mother, wider, more careful, the smile of someone presenting themselves for evaluation. I sat at the extended table. It was a good table. My cousin Daphne was there, and my Aunt Leora, and a handful of family friends I'd known most of my life. They were warm and glad to see me, and the view from the east window was, in fact, lovely. I ate. I talked. I watched my mother at the family table, holding court for Sylvia and Garrett's father, a quiet man named Douglas who sat beside his wife with the expression of someone who had learned to trust her instincts. Petra was radiant. That's the word. I watched her during the ceremony, and she was simply, completely radiant, and I was glad. Whatever else was true, she was happy, and the day was beautiful, and both of those things were real. The reception began, and the toasts were made. Garrett's best man, then the maid of honor, then my father, brief and warm. My mother did not toast. She had decided it wasn't traditional. No one toasted me. After the formal toasts, the room shifted into the conversational phase, people moving between tables, drinks in hand, the string quartet transitioning to something lighter. I was talking with Daphne when I noticed Sylvia moving through the room with a deliberateness that separated her from the general circulation. She was looking at the flowers. She stood beneath the floral installation above the head table for a long moment, tilting her head slightly the way people do when they are genuinely appreciating something they did not expect. Then she turned and looked across the room until she found Jules, the catering coordinator, and she walked to her and said something I couldn't hear from my table. Jules answered. Then Jules turned and looked across the room. She looked for me. I saw it happen, the moment her eyes found mine, and something in my chest went very still. Jules said something further to Sylvia. Sylvia turned and looked where Jules was looking. And then Sylvia began walking toward the east window table. My mother, from the family table, tracked this movement. I saw the moment she registered it. The slight pause in her conversation, the way her chin lifted, the particular stillness that moves through someone when they are watching something they don't yet understand. Sylvia arrived at my table with the bearing of a woman who had spent 40 years moving through rooms and had learned that the most efficient path was always the direct one. "Excuse me," she said, to the table generally and then to me specifically. "Are you Rowan?" I stood. "I am." She extended her hand. "Your coordinator pointed you out. I've been trying to understand who is responsible for the floral installation above the head table. She tells me you commissioned it." "I did." "And the caterer?" "Jules says you're the account holder." "That's right." Sylvia looked at me with the precise, evaluating attention of someone who has learned to distinguish between people who manage things and people who merely speak about managing things. "Did you arrange this entire event?" I looked at her steadily. "I coordinated all of the vendors, yes. The venue contract, the florist, the caterer, the string quartet, the transportation. The invitations were designed by someone I work with." "And funded?" There was a silence. "In substantial part," I said. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that did not carry, it was a controlled voice, not a performing voice, "Your name isn't in the program."
No.
"That's interesting." She looked at me for another moment, and then she looked across the room toward the family table, and I watched her expression settle into something I recognized from negotiations, the face of someone who has just recalibrated a situation entirely. "I'd like you to come meet my husband," she said. It wasn't a question. My cousin Daphne put her hand briefly on my arm as I stood. I picked up my glass and I followed Sylvia across the reception floor. We passed the family table. My mother saw us coming, saw Sylvia leading, saw me following, and her face went through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds. The third one was something I don't have a word for. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something that looked like the moment you realize the load-bearing wall was never where you thought it was. Sylvia brought me to Douglas, her husband, who stood and shook my hand and asked, in a genuine, unhurried way, how long I had been in the events and design space and what my firm worked on. We talked for several minutes. He was easy to talk to. At one point he gestured at the tent, at the flowers, at the lighting, at the arrangement of tables, and said, "This is a beautiful event. Really considered. You can tell someone thought about every piece of it." "Thank you," I said. "I spent about 18 months on it." He looked at me. 18 months. It's a big property. The logistics are involved. He nodded slowly. "And you run your own firm?" "A small one. For people based in Portland." "Doing this kind of work?" "Commercial interiors, primarily. But I know vendors." He smiled in a way that meant he understood exactly what I know vendors meant in practice. By this point we had acquired an audience. Not a gathered crowd. This was not that kind of moment, but the natural drift of a reception in which one social cluster has become more interesting than another. Garrett had moved to stand near his father. The maid of honor had drifted over. Several of the guests from the Seattle side of the table had arranged themselves nearby in the casual way people do when they're listening, without wanting to appear to be listening. My mother had stood from the family table. She was standing approximately 10 feet away, with a glass of champagne. She was not drinking. Sylvia said, "Douglas, Rowan arranged the entire event. The venue, the vendors, she has the contracts." Douglas looked at my mother. Not unkindly, just directly. I didn't realize. I assumed you had a professional planner. My mother opened her mouth. Sylvia said, gently but without ambiguity, I think your daughter may be more capable than your program suggested. The maid of honor made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. Garrett looked at his shoes. Douglas looked at the flowers. My mother's hand found the back of the nearest chair. I did not look at her. I kept my attention on Douglas and Sylvia, and I said, it was a privilege to put it together. Petra has good taste. I just made sure the execution matched her vision. Sylvia looked at me carefully. And your mother's vision? Those two things were very aligned, I said. Sylvia smiled. It was a precise smile. I'm sure they were. I stayed with Garrett's family for another 20 minutes. We talked about the firm, about Portland, about a commercial project Douglas mentioned knowing from mutual contact. At some point Garrett said, Rowan, I want you to know I didn't know the seating was. And I told him, honestly, that it was fine, and that the day had been beautiful, and that I was glad he and Petra were happy. He looked relieved and grateful in the particular way people look when they have been let off a hook they mostly didn't set. I returned to the east window table. My champagne glass had been refilled. Daphne squeezed my arm and said nothing, and I was grateful for that too. The rest of the evening was quiet, at least for me. The string quartet played beautifully. The food was exceptional. Jules had run a seamless operation, and I made a point of telling her so before the night was over. The floral installation above the head table glowed in the low lighting like something from a photograph. My mother did not come to speak to me during the reception. My father found me briefly, near the end of the evening, and said, with the particular smile he used when he had no language for a situation, Good night, Rowan. I said good night. I drove home with the radio off and the window down. The calls began 4 days later. Not from my mother first, from Petra. She called on a Tuesday evening, and I let it ring once, and then I answered because whatever was happening between me and my parents was not Petra's fault, and I had made a decision to keep those things separate. Sylvia called Mom, she said, without preamble. I waited. She didn't call to be mean. She called to say she had no idea I had a sister who ran her own design firm, and that she found it strange that you hadn't been more involved in the wedding. Involved, like, officially. On the program. I see. Asterisk. She asked Mom who the account holder was for the venue and the catering. Mom said, I don't know what Mom said, but Sylvia apparently said she looked it up and that your name was on multiple contracts and… Asterisk. Petra's voice shifted. Rowan, why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? How much you paid for? How much of it was you? I thought about that. Because you were getting married. And I wanted your wedding to be your wedding. She was quiet. Then, the seating thing wasn't my idea. I know. I should have.
Petra.
You were getting married. You had other things to think about. She cried briefly. I let her. I didn't say much. When she came back she said, Garrett's mother wants to meet with you. Professionally. She has a project. I said I was open to that. She said she couldn't believe someone with your contacts and your organizational instincts was sitting at the cousins' table. I said, it was a nice table. Good view. Petra laughed a little. I love you. You know that. I know, I said. I love you too. That was the easy call. My mother called 3 days after that. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message, which was 40 seconds of careful wording that essentially said, I think there may have been a misunderstanding, and I would love to talk. I called her back the following morning. The conversation was a specific kind of difficult, not hostile, but slow, like moving furniture through a doorway that is exactly 1 inch too narrow. My mother does not apologize directly. She circles. She recontextualizes. She says things like, I never meant for it to come across that way, and you have to understand what the pressure was like, and I was just trying to make sure everything went smoothly. I let her talk. When she was done, I said, I know. I understand the pressure. And I want you to know that the day was beautiful and Petra was happy, and I'm glad it worked out. So Mom, I said, I'm going to need a few months. She was quiet. Not forever. Just some space. I have a lot of work right now. Rowan, I'll be in touch. I love you. I hung up. My father called a week later. We talked for 10 minutes about the restaurant, about Portland, about the weather. Before he hung up, he said, "Your mother is having a hard time." I said, "I know, Dad." She didn't mean. I know.
He sighed.
You're a good person, Rowan. I said, I learned from good people. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your grandmother used to say that about you. I know, I said. She told me. The project Sylvia had mentioned materialized 6 weeks later. She was involved in the early planning stages of a boutique hotel development in Eastern Oregon, a conversion of a historic property outside Bend, and her investment group was looking for an interior design firm to consult on the adaptive reuse. It was a substantial engagement, the kind that takes a firm from 4 people to 6 if you want it to. I took the meeting. I drove to Seattle on a Tuesday morning, which is something I am now allowed to say, and I sat across from Sylvia and her partner, and I showed them the portfolio, and I talked about timelines and vendor relationships and the specific challenges of adaptive reuse in historic properties, and at the end of the meeting Sylvia looked at me and said, I find it very clarifying to work with people who understand that competence is not the same thing as loudness. I signed the letter of engagement 3 weeks later. My grandmother left me a letter, which I mentioned earlier. I kept it in the same folder as the vendor contracts for a while. I don't know exactly why, except that it felt right to have them together. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, in the careful, precise cursive she had used her whole life. She talked about the dry cleaning business and about my grandfather and about what she had learned from 31 years of making sure other people's things came back to them clean and pressed and ready. Near the end she wrote, You have always been the person who makes things work. The world needs those people more than it admits. Don't let anyone convince you that invisible work is worthless work. The receipts exist. You keep them. Someday someone will ask to see them, and when they do, you hand them over calmly and let them read. I think about that a lot. The receipts exist. You keep them. You hand them over calmly. That's the whole lesson. I didn't need the satisfaction of confrontation. I didn't need a speech or a moment of performance. I just needed someone in that room to ask the right question, and for the answer to be true, and for the paperwork to say what the paperwork said. I think the people who dismiss the quiet ones are counting on them to stay quiet. They miscalculate. Not always. Not quickly. But eventually, in a tent with good flowers on a mountain outside Bend, someone asks whose name is on the contract. And the answer doesn't change. That's my story. A vendor folder, a printed schedule with my name on every contract and nowhere in the program, and a table by the east window with a very good view. If you had been at that reception, if you had coordinated and paid for $41,000 of someone's wedding day and then been handed a seat at the cousin's table and told to sit quietly, what would you have done when Sylvia asked whose name was on the contract? Would you have told her everything, let it go quietly, or something in between? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.